All right. So this was work that was originally going to be presented by Josh Peterson, who's a postdoc of mine, but he wasn't able to make it today. So what I want to talk about is how it is that getting more data changes the things that we do in psychology. So so if we take our sort of standard psychological methods and then we just explore what the consequences are of actually having substantially more data. And I'm going to do this through two case studies. So one case study in decision making, one in categorization, and these are selected to be kind of relatively generic kinds of sort of cognitive psychological problems, the cases where we can see an impact of having these kinds of data sets. So the questions that we were interested in decision making were really understanding how it is that our ability to predict and understand human decisions can be changed by having more data about the decisions that people make. And so to investigate this, we looked at the Drosophila of decision making, which is risky choice, right? So the way that this works, what we do is ask people questions about, if you're given a choice between two gambles, which of these gambles would you prefer? So you could get on the left 16 points with certainty, or on the right 1 point with probability 0.6, 44 with probability 0.1, 48 with probability 0.1, 50 with probability 0.2. And these points translate into dollars. So in our experiment, part of the payoff that people receive is a consequence of selecting one of the gambles that they decide on. And so what we wanted to do is we collect a large amount of data about the choices that people make here. And our inspiration for doing this came from something that was called the choice prediction competition. So in the choice prediction competition, Erev et al., the group at the Technion, collected people's choices between 150 pairs of gambles. And this was the largest data set that had been collected on decision making at this time. It included some gambles that were designed to elicit sort of classic effects that had been found in the decision-making literature, as well as a bunch of other gambles that they generated via an algorithmic procedure. So those algorithmically generated gambles were chosen basically by treating these different values, the payoffs and the probabilities, as parameters, and then having an algorithm for generating those parameters so that you were then going to get these points that were sampled into the space. And so what they did was then analyze, well, what are the consequences of having these kinds of data? Can you predict the decisions that people make using a variety of psychological models and methods of machine learning? And what they found was that the psychological models did well, the machine learning models did less well, the machine learning models did better if you included some psychology in them. And so this sort of seemed like a case where the best prediction models were actually ones that were using some kind of psychological theory. So we were interested in what happens here if we just change the amount of data that we have about human decision making significantly. So what we did was go from 150 pairs of gambles to 13,000 pairs of gambles. So we increased the data set by 2 orders of magnitude. And then we had 20 choices per pair that were solicited using Amazon Mechanical Turk. And so we ended up with this very large data set, just to get a sense of sort of how large this is relatively. So this is a 2-dimensional embedding of the higher dimensional space that I just talked about. So if you take each of those parameters of those gambles, and you can think about each of those as one dimension, we can take that space and then we're going to project it down to 2 dimensions. This is actually a representation that comes from one of the neural network models that we use for predicting people's choices. And so these are now sort of organized by their how related they are in terms of ability to predict people's choices. But the red dots here correspond to the studies that were sort of the classic studies in the literature. The blue dots correspond to the rest of the choice prediction problem. And then the black dots are all of the other points in that space that we probed as a consequence of running our studies. And so here, again, the point is that those red dots were selected by psychologists thinking really hard about what's an experiment that I can do that'll show that people demonstrate this particular effect or have this particular bias or reason in this particular way. The blue dots are ones that were generated procedurally, and then the black dots are ones that we generated in the same sort of procedural way of sort of just exploring the space. And as a consequence, we get a much more comprehensive data set that we can use for actually evaluating models of decision making, because we've generated those points in a way that's unbiased. That there's no sort of theory that goes into the choice of the points that we're actually generating. And so as a consequence of that, the kind of psychology that we can do is a different kind, where we can just say, well, here are the kinds of things that could possibly be going on here. Let's just exhaustively evaluate all of those things and figure out which of these things actually make sense. And so for decision making, there's a nice space that you can use to characterize these models. So the sort of classic story about how people make decisions is expected utility theory. And so here the idea is that people are making decisions by making probability that they're going to choose a particular option, option A, will be determined by the expected utility of that option, where this utility function here is a function that takes some form. And what we did was go to the psychological literature. We found like every proposal we could find for what the form of that function is. Most of those are sort of functions that have a couple of parameters that we can estimate from data. And we also did a model where we freely estimated the form of that function. So using a non-parametric model like a neural network, where we basically, because this whole thing is a differentiable model, we can differentiate through and we can actually optimize for what's the form of that function that best characterizes human behavior. And so the next most complex class of models is prospect theory. So now you have the same kind of flexibility about what this function is, but you're applying this to probabilities as well. So now we're going to say, we're not just learning a utility function, we're also estimating how it is that people transform the probabilities of different outcomes when they're evaluating a choice. And then the next most complex class is what we call value-based choice model. So here the idea is there's some way that you're evaluating each of these options. So if you're choosing between A and B, you have a value that you're going to assign to A, a value that you assign to B. But then what the theory says is how you compute that value, and it doesn't have to take this kind of functional form. And again, we can freely estimate those forms. And then finally, what we call context-dependent choice models, where now we're just making a model for the probability that you make that choice. So it doesn't say that you value things and you make a decision based on those values. It just says there's some way that you put together the probabilities and the payoffs that are associated with those two gambles, and then that's the thing that ends up helping you make a decision. And so we can then compare all of these different theories in terms of how well they explain the data that we got from the experiment. So the way that I'm going to show you this is this is as a function of our training data set size. So this is the proportion of the data set that we're using. And then this is the validation error. So whenever we evaluated these models, we're looking at their generalization performance. So we hold out some portion of the data set and we look at their ability to predict behavior on that portion of the data set when trained on the remainder. And so these gray lines correspond to all of the proposals that we could find for the form of those expected utility models, right? So the form of the utility function. And some of these fit much better than others. And so what we're looking at here is how well we're able to predict the proportion of times people make a particular choice. Some of these models do better than others, but the main thing you notice is that all of those curves are flat. So they're not really models that benefit from having a lot of data. And that kind of makes sense. They have a couple of parameters. They're things that were designed in this kind of small data regime we've been talking about, where you didn't have lots of data about human behavior. This is the best fitting model when we allow that sort of free search over the space of utility functions. And as you can see, I think this is a sort of victory for intelligent, careful thought by psychological scientists, is that the best hypotheses that the humans came up with are slightly better than what we can do if we just take a lot of data and then use that functional form and optimize for it. This is what that form looks like. So anybody who studies decision making, this is very familiar. It looks like the thing that people had to think really hard to determine, and now we can just derive it automatically as a consequence of having enough data. And so this is showing the difference between losses and gains in people's evaluation of these gambles. Okay, so the next thing we can do is add in all of the prospect theory models. So when we do that, you can see the best prospect theory models are slightly better than the best expected utility models. And it turns out when we search over the space of functions, we can get a prospect theory model which is even better than the ones that psychologists came up with. And so these are what these functions look like. So the probability weighting function is actually relatively linear, and then this is our estimated utility function in the same way. And so just to make this simpler, I'm just going to sort of just focus on these two versions of these models. And now we can start to put in these other more complex models. So if you put in the model where you're learning to predict the value for each gamble, you're just learning a function that characterizes the value for each gamble. It turns out that the model which starts with prospect theory actually does a little better. So strictly, this class of functions is contained within this class. So it should be possible to discover at least something that's good. But what this is showing is the limits of the kind of optimization procedure here. The functional form of prospect theory is actually a really good inductive bias for capturing the way that people make decisions. And so this is another sort of victory for psychology. Again, like thinking really hard about what the form of the function should means that you end up with a model that has an inductive bias that's good for capturing human behavior and beats this generic model here. And then we can start thinking about these models which are now integrating information across both of the gambles, not simply assigning a value. When we looked at the psychological models to do this, the best model is actually the one that Arab and colleagues developed as a consequence of running that choice prediction competition. It's called BEAST, or Best Estimate and Sampling Tools. And it's basically, I think they just came up with that name for the acronym. But what it does is it does expected utility, and then it has like 4 different heuristics that are based on simulating samples from the gambles, and it sort of, as a consequence, has this sort of more integrative, form to it. So this says, okay, yeah, so not trying to estimate the value of each option and integrating information across both options, you do better than something like prospect theory. But if we just search in that class of functions, which is now just allowing us to build a predictive model that goes from the features of the gambles to people's choices, we get a model which does even better, right? And so the key point here is that there's a huge amount of additional variation in people's choices, which is not being accounted for by the best psychological models we have, and that having more data is something that allows us to reveal that. So this is systematic variation in people's behavior that we weren't able to see before. Now, it's worth pointing out that we were sort of cheating here insofar as this is the size of the largest previous data set, right? So over here, this is the regime that psychology was in before. And if you look at this amount of data, the psychological model is beating the machine learning model, right? So living in that world where we had limited amounts of data, the psychologist thinking really hard was the best way of coming up with these theories. But as we get more data, we start to get into a regime where psychologists thinking hard is not necessarily the best way of building predictive models that account for the way that people make decisions. That doesn't mean that psychologists should stop thinking hard. So one of the things that we did was think about how is it that we can actually use psychological theory to improve on these machine learning methods. We came up with a simple way of doing that, which we call cognitive model priors. And the way that this works, what we do is you can think about it as an empirical-based procedure. So we estimate a cognitive model like the BEAST model. We then generate a large artificial data set from that model, which we use to pre-train our machine learning model. And that acts as a prior in that model. It regularizes it towards an initial solution, which actually encapsulates the knowledge in that psychological theory. And then we're able to then fine-tune the machine learning model on the original data. And so when we do that, that produces this curve, which is shown here. So it always does better than the best psychological model and better than the best machine learning model. So it's something where using a hybrid of those strategies is something which is ultimately better than trying to do one of those things on their own. But I think this is a good illustration of, like this gap is the thing that we're revealing more and more as we get more data. And this is the thing that we need to think about how to innovate around in order to come up with better psychological theories that can leverage the amount of data that we're working with. Okay, so the second case study is in the domain of categorization. And for me, the motivation for doing this was Yahoo put out this data set, which is a data set of 100 million images that were taken from Flickr. And these images have all been labeled by Flickr users. So they're all tagged with things that humans think are reasonable labels for those images, which can include things like holiday or, as well as more informative things like sunset or something like that. So each of these dots corresponds to one image, right? And this is more data on human categorization than the entire history of the psychological literature on categorization. And so to me, I was like, well, yeah, okay. we need to figure out how to be able to use those kinds of data sets to answer the questions that we have as psychologists. So part of what's compelling about this is that these are natural images. And a lot of psychological research on categorization is done with images that look like this, right? So psychology experiments, we try and abstract down to the simplest possible version of things. And in doing that, we may lose some of the critical information about the thing that we actually originally set out to study. So something like this has the advantage of, you can just describe it by a couple of parameters, in this case, the orientation and the spatial frequency. And you know what those parameters are. You can work out how people might be representing variation along those dimensions. And it gives you a lot of precision for testing computational models. But as was pointed out earlier, the sorts of striky objects that humans actually have to categorize are maybe things that are more like this. And there's a question of what you're losing when you focus on that rather than that. But the problem that you have is if you want to work with things like this, then you need to have a way of determining what the underlying stimulus structure is. And so the way that we solve that problem is by using representations that come from the kinds of models that Lucy was talking about, convolutional neural networks. And as a way of establishing that this is a reasonable thing to do, the first thing we did was look at how well we can use these models to capture human similarity judgments to images. And so this is from some data that we collected where we showed people 120 images of animals, and then we asked them to rate how similar pairs of images were. And then we predicted the similarity that people judged between those images using representations that were drawn from those convolutional neural networks. And so I'm going to show you results for animals, but we did this in 5 different domains, and we have another data set that's a cross-domain data set, and you see similar kinds of results. But basically what we find is that the convolutional neural networks on the left here, this is the raw convolutional neural network performance. They do a surprisingly good job if you just take those representations and try and predict similarity. And then you can do a linear transformation to those representations and get an even better correspondence between the neural network representations and people's judgments. So here, just to give you a sense, if you just take half of our human data and correlate it against the other half of our human data, this is the R squared that we get. So we're approaching the level where we're really doing a really good job of capturing the variance in this data. So having done that, we could then ask questions about how it is that people categorize things. And so the way that we did this was taking a classic computer vision data set called CFAR10, which consists of images that are relatively low resolution, like these images here. And those images come from 10 different categories. So we just asked people to tell us for each of those images what the category looks like. And so some examples of responses here on the right. So, for the image on the top, it's sort of relatively unambiguously an airplane. This is relatively unambiguously a cat. This is a little harder to figure out exactly what it is. As is this. This is actually like a ostrich. Yeah, right. So you're and so the idea here is that this is allowing us to get at the sort of use of more naturalistic stimuli, but still within a relatively constrained domain where we have a relatively limited number of categories. But even getting these data allow us to engage with a classic question that comes up in the literature on categorization. And so this is a question about how it is that people represent the structure of categories. And so 2 classic proposals about this are, one is that you represent categories in terms of a prototype. So your category of cats is something that you get from observing all of these cats and then abstracting away some idealized representation of what a member of that category looks like. And then the way that you decide what category something belongs to is by comparing it to that idealized representation. Whereas an alternative proposal is that what you do is, don't do any abstraction, but rather just remember all of the different cats that you've seen. And when you're trying to figure out if something is a cat, you compare it to all of those cats that you have in your memory. And so what we find when we compare to the predictions of these models against people's behavior using different kinds of representations that are derived from these neural network models, is that the psychological literature from lab studies with simple stimuli had said that there was this sort of strong evidence for exemplar-like models. And essentially it's because they can produce more complex kinds of categorization boundaries. But when we look with these high-dimensional naturalistic stimuli in the context of our experiments, what we find is that advantage of exemplar models goes away. So you can just look here. These correspond to different exemplar models. These correspond to different prototype models. And the critical thing here is that we're finding prototype models which are giving equivalent and in some cases better performance in predicting people's judgments than some of the exemplar models. And one way of understanding that is that the relative advantage of exemplar models over prototype models changes as we change the property of our stimuli. And so what this figure shows is as we increase the number of dimensions along the sort of number of features of those stimuli, and then the number of samples that we get from a category, we can plot out the relative advantage of exemplar models over prototype models in terms of solving categorization problems. And then this is done for different kinds of categorization boundaries at the top. From a simple linear boundary between categories, something which is like a, sort of another, more like a quadratic boundary, things which then start to get increasingly complex as we move along here. And so in this graph, red shows an advantage for exemplar models, and blue shows an advantage for prototype models in terms of being able to solve this problem. And so the main thing that you can see is that you get a big advantage for exemplar models when you have stimuli that have fewer dimensions. And part of the way of understanding that is that those prototype models, because you're comparing to the nearest prototype, that guarantees that you have to have a relatively simple classification boundary. Whereas the exemplar models, they can have arbitrary classification boundaries. But the difference between having a simple versus a complex categorization boundary is more pronounced in a low-dimensional space than in a high-dimensional space. If you've got a high-dimensional space, because you can put that simple boundary in all sorts of places, then the advantage that comes from having that more complex decision boundary kind of goes away. And so there's a sense in which by boiling things down to using those simple kinds of stimuli, we had turned the problem into one which made it so that certain classes of models would a priori be the things that were going to be more likely to be able to capture people's behavior. I guess I should mention that the data set that we collected here consists of 500,000 human judgments for these categorization tasks, which you need to do because we have 10,000 images that are then classified into these 10 different categories. And so that's what we needed the scaling to do. So as an advantage of being able to operate at that kind of scale, we're able to then use models that have these kind of more naturalistic sorts of stimuli. The other thing that's interesting about this is that actually having that human data is something which is also a benefit for the computer science perspective. So one of the things that we're able to show is that if you take these kinds of convolutional neural networks and we train them on the human labels rather than on training them on the way they're standardly trained, which is you choose a single category and you say that's the right answer, they end up doing better in terms of being able to generalize across different data sets. So one of the limitations of these models classically is that they do a poor job in generalizing beyond the data set that they were originally trained on. And just by training on this more, diffuse sort of error distribution that people produce, you end up getting models that generalize better and that turn out to be more robust to what are called adversarial attacks, where you try and present images that confuse the network and produce the wrong label. And the reason for this is that those human labels tell you not just this thing is a dog, but also if it's not a dog, it might be a cat. And that information tells you that dogs and cats should be sort of closer together in the space. And so being able to use that kind of information makes these computer vision systems work better. Okay, so what happens to psychology when we get more data? I think the high-level point here is that more data helps us to reveal systematic variation that our theories are still too simple to capture. And so this gets back to one of the challenges that I was talking about before, which is how to do psychology in a regime where we start to live in a world that's more complex than the kinds of things that we are able to imagine. But on the bright side, I think these results also show how theory is valuable. So in both of these cases, having this sort of psychological theory about how people might make decisions, or having the context of sort of thinking about why it is that human errors might be informative, is something that allows us to improve on the solutions that we get by naively applying methods that come from machine learning. And so the models that are constrained by psychological theory are things that can outperform unconstrained machine learning methods. And I actually see this as a big opportunity and a big reason why cognitive science should be concerned about scaling, which is not just that it's something that might help us answer our own scientific questions, but because it's something that helps us to engage with the increasing use of these kinds of methods across many different disciplines. And it shows how you can go from doing something which is what I would characterize as behaviorist data science, right? Which is taking the methods of data science and trying to use them to learn the stimulus-response relationships that characterize human behavior, to a more informed cognitive science where we're using the things that we know as cognitive scientists about the latent variables that mediate those relationships to build better statistical models that allow us to understand what people might be doing. And I think the third important conclusion here is that what we learn from large naturalistic studies can be very different from the small studies that we do in the lab. And so this is another point where it's not just more, it's different. That by being able to collect data at scale, that allows us to then think about, well, maybe we can circumvent some of the decisions that we had to make our problems simple enough that we could study them using the kinds of data sets and kinds of methods that we're used to using in technology. So we can be, I think, a little bolder and a little less, afraid of less controlled stimuli if we can get enough data that allows us to get the kind of insight that we want to be able to get without requiring that same level of, sort of, fine-grained experimental control that we're used to looking for as psychologists. So, thank you.
Okay, a couple quick notes about what's happening next. It's lunchtime until 1:30, but that includes the poster session. If people with posters could plan at being at their posters from, let's say, 12:45 to 1:30, that'll be our attended poster session. At 1:30, we're going to have, you'll see in the schedule, it says project proposals. Basically, we have 2 breakout sessions this afternoon, and each of them you're going to have 4 options to choose from. These are broad experiment ideas that somebody in the audience is thinking of doing. They have some project they want to do, and they want your help in thinking through how that might be done online. And obviously, I hope this is useful for them, but I hope that it's going to be useful for everybody, especially people who haven't gone through trying to, design their own massive online studies. I think that they'll get a lot from actually trying to think. This is all all that classic work on deep encoding versus just shallow processing. Hopefully, you were deeply encoding everything the speaker said this morning, but in case not, you'll get some more deep encoding this afternoon. And so we'll meet back here at 1:30.
So you'll get advertisements for
yes, exactly. So 1:30 we'll have advertisement, short advertisements that allow you to choose what you're going to go to. Yeah.
And those advertisements are basically anybody who's interested. There's no.
There are pre-selected people who are presenting advertisements. They have 8 of them, so there'll be 4 for the first session. There's 4 options for the first session, 4 options for the second session.
Archive or categorization?
Yeah.
Usually related to things that we are doing.
Okay.
At some point, not doing before.
Yeah.
That's
good.
A lot of them with a lot of connecting.
Okay, good. Yeah. So it's on archive, or you can email the authors; they can give you the latest. Okay, good.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, I would be super interested in hearing more about the galaxy constellation, the galaxy composition more than the
What are the or if you actually want to buy it,
we have no data on
how real are these already, right? So
they are.
Thinking about maybe because we're being biased, thinking that they are being more careful. So is there evidence that this translates to actual prejudice?
Yeah. So that's the question about the validity of the construct. And
there's not for us.
correlation, whether we find measures. And there's a good question about whether the validity information has been effect. They show bimodal compositions, so how many do they never show the same in-group bias, like the white, so they don't show that to other cultures where you have different 10%. Yeah.
And right now we're interested in, I'm working with ethnographers and things like that to understand what the community along with the constraints of like are the data that y'all have on your platform about communication, like the team, is that public or is that private?
The research
Okay.
it would be on a team by team basis together. So the wider you are, and the lighter is because how you're aware, like right? So the size would be very different. But there's so many good formats. Find the opposite, like Korean. The other thing which and newslettering is where we're going. Work, you know, if you're individual communication therapies, right? You can look at just all data, like look at how Will Smith is doing, including models where you have sort of say some latent variables that express sort of how popular or how unpopular or how what the amount of negative connotation is.
One of the things that we have is kind of practical. So open
from your plotting, you have the sense that you don't compare and match up.
People
but you
really
could
hard time recruiting
make something about Will Smith, right?
Right.
It's
So
true.
I'm
You
interested in
can
like
from the
what
IAT
does it mean?
data, right? You have the
Form, what you can do on GitHub and what you can't like in
I like
every day.
right? But can
So
you
we've
back
got
it out
this like
to the
combination
IAT?
of understanding what are the basic dynamics, like what's the
No, so
what's the
we have to
common
try to
theme
look at
among like the community, how to kind of most communities generally form communities, generally talk to each other, and how do these community specific top down strains the language that we use, like even bubbles of language. And specifically right now we're interested in a couple of things that were identified from psychology and
I guess what I'm saying is
understanding gratitude and positive and negative sentiment.
think compared to what you're doing about with others, right? You only code the words that are big data.
Exactly.
So can you then
exactly. And so there are some interesting things around how people think
for each individual.
what acronyms communicate on GitHub is a little bit different.
That would be really cool.
Contribute to a community in two ways. You can
order
provide like a fix on
I'm thinking about
here's
these
my
Smithsonian,
code.
I'm not
Like,
sure
or you can say
where
like,
you basically have an underlying scale of features.
and so we're also interested in seeing like how people's entry
Figure out what
community
the
based
relevant
on
ordering is.
kind of their
So
offering.
Will Smith might be out there, but
Shape
you're
their
the prompt them.
and then their decisions come back
But
so those are the kinds of
so you
things
need
that
to
we're
think
working
about
on now. We're
why the
interested
line
in
we don't
doing
know about
some additional stuff because now we're just trying to push out the first
right.
paper, but understanding, for example, one person as a multiple project, how their communication is constrained by specific projects that they're in at the time, and so this is the same kind of thread. They can go and say all of their projects. A lot of people who are very heavy contributors to multiple projects. As I would imagine, with yours, exactly. And so like seeing how people are choosing to engage with that versus, like, am I the same person throughout? How much is negotiated by like this constraint
only when the back
based on like being able to pick that up in the positive or negative of the people.
So one interesting thing that we have found is when we have to launch a project and they are only
that's the most like a thing though.
You need a moderator to moderate a forum, right?
Yes, required.
Okay, I don't think required, it's encouraged, right? Because it's much more helpful if you have one. But so then there's this sort of panic of like, well, how do we get moderators? And it's like, yeah, it's okay. Typically, moderators with now we can, if they have a project situation of another project, you can say, okay, given the circumstances, we can maybe reach out to the moderator from that project and the launch phase of it. And typically, someone
out
of the volunteers
to show the statistical
Yeah.
will
Yeah.
actually
I mean, like,
start
But it predicts
acting
stuff.
like a
But
volunteer.
yeah.
exactly.
And so I have always
Sure.
wondered,
It's more complicated. You need to predict
is
stuff
there
that you
some
can
way
say
to
what it is.
predict?
Yeah.
Oh, that would be really interesting. Who of the volunteers on the platform do you have that you're most likely
But not well replicated in a meta.
Yeah. You can do
You
like
don't quite. If you can AI and predict validity more when the area is sensitive. So that's
And that's public, right? Like, so it's a badge that says, I'm just a, you know, okay. Yeah. Yes, and we have that in GitHub too, where not initially, we have this interesting shift as a platform change. People who, when you couldn't see their standing in the community versus when that started to become available, and you started to see who it was. And so there are things like, for example, like a first-time contributor badge that happens on GitHub, and if someone is brand new, hopefully making it so that like people will be like, we on this person. Don't yell at them. Yes, exactly. So I can definitely see that kind of social, like visible social standing is being important. And so the question that you raised is also similar to one that we're considering right now as a follow-up project. We want to understand burnout in the open source software community, which I can imagine too is a big problem with how you're dealing with this on your platform as well, especially if you have these super volunteers wanting to be able to maintain them and not have them like. Ugh. So one of the things that we've been thinking about from a privacy standpoint is that we probably, like, just for consideration of a person, we probably don't want to target a person and say like this person is at risk for burnout or this person like for identifiability reasons, but instead to identify healthy or unhealthy communities. To say like let's analyze the community and see what happens when there's a lot of dropout happening at that community level. You can do an intervention at the community instead of targeting.
Well, this is an interesting thing to as well from the point of view of the health, the general health of a citizen measure project.
Yeah.
We find from previous studies and just from observation that the health of the discussion community is a good metric for the general health of the project. If the researchers and the volunteers are talking to each other, then it tends to be that more people are engaging, more people want to take part, and it's a more successful project. So those kind of health measurements as well are super interesting from our point of view.
So there's a lot of there's several papers that have already analyzed the Hopper discussion board data, and it's pretty easy to get to there if you just go to universe.org/. So universe.org/publications. Okay. There's like meta-analyses. Yeah. And they're like
so we've had people work on like when you talk about the types of work used, we've shown that like communities build up technical terms that are specific to their community and not to the actual science.
Nice to meet you. Yeah.
Like that, or like
talk.
the main types of interaction that happen, like a community doesn't really act like social media in a way. Like most of what people are saying is one quick thing, and then kind of similarly to GitHub, find a problem or find something interesting.
It's not easy,
so
but I think
there's a difference that they
kind of
have a look in that section in the message of our publication list, and you'll see there's literacy that are already studying that ideas. They might give you some like understanding of what's in the core and what
And then is it a violation of your terms of service to create a box history? I want to make sure that like if it's available, I just want to be able to present things to the rest of my team.
the talk that's on Universe is open, publicly available online. I don't think we have nothing in place that you can straight from top pages.
Right.
So I'm happy we're going ahead and do that. I think from our ethical point of view, we have our own ethics for how we think about our volunteers. We'd like to at least write a blog post or something about it, let them know what you're doing and what you're studying. Maybe you can talk to say, listen, I'm looking into this. We like to be pretty open to the volunteers whenever we're studying them.
Great. Because the reason I asked that there may be selection effects if
dominant,
depending on like what's okay and what's publicly available. I don't want people to like if there's an unresponsive team that might be unresponsive because they're terribly busy. Right. Like so if we want to be able to get like a good subset, it may be something where if there's like a way to let everybody know hey, this is what we're doing rather than
That makes
could,
sense.
have that,
Exactly.
like, could bring alarm bells.
No, because I think you're right about the selection, right? And if we're talking
Exactly,
about
and so
how
what we don't know, what
a
we
healthy
haven't
process when
done
the scientists
is
are
we
engaged,
haven't
then you
done
might
a study to find out what
legitimately
that.
get better engagement from healthy process. Did you ask
Yeah.
about
No, right.
and just
Yeah.
to let you know,
But just to let,
yeah.
yeah.
One big change we made was we introduced that project order we talked about a bit earlier, and we've gone from having a few projects to others.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
created at that point a discussion, a top level discussion area, which is cross project. So it's for the universe rather than just all the discussion on the project. So that might also include, I don't know, have talked about comparing people interacting there versus
Yeah,
projects.
imagine like maybe some cross-communication or typically that's sort of words that would emerge from that level communication, right? Let's just get started. That's just, you might imagine that filters down from that exposure to that.
But I'm thinking of
Yeah.
going
Positive, like, maybe that filters down.
more intelligent application.
So yeah,
Yeah, this is what we have.
if you want to
Yeah,
have
so
more
we have, those are those,
in-depth discussions, then email contact us.
sophisticated,
It'll probably end up in my desk or Lucy's desk.
processes whereby we
for dealing with
monitor
external researchers like
skills
yourself, and then
or get,
it sounds like a really
some
cool study
volunteer
to
parameters,
that would be happy
you know.
to share as much data with you
And
as we
so
possibly can. We're quite
we,
flexible.
we have some of those algorithms.
Yeah, no problem. Nice to meet
Wonderful,
you.
but the way we,
Yeah. I'm sure I'll see you around.
the way we implemented,
So if there's any other questions you have.
should we just go?
Yeah, let's go.
Have lunch? Yeah.
Hello, again, how are you?
See you again.
Good to see you too.
So the way we've implemented is.
I guess like the common ground. I was gonna head out. We actually found a senior. Okay. We just got a senior. That's cool. Excited to see this. I've been waiting for a while. Exciting. So, sorry. Nice to meet you. Yes, I'm gonna go out.
So how far along are you with undergrad?
17.
Oh, you're a senior, okay. Okay, so
Yeah, sometimes very often.
I think you were applying to grad school or are you in top?
Not sure. Yeah, I think it was. But I'm interested in one. I'm thinking about, like, I really enjoy thinking about, and I also enjoy thinking about data. It took me like 4 years just to get acquainted with cognitive science.
Yeah, I mean, it's
To,
so
like,
broad.
even to know, like, to ask the question of, like, oh, what stuff would you do with the discipline of we're in? Right? That's something that I think a lot.
Yeah, and it's so broad, like, I was really impressed with
That was I
yeah, and like this sort of that also makes me feel like there's more road for connection. Some areas are space, areas back a lot of times cross pollination. They're probably really not very
yeah. Yeah. I also like they consider the industry. I don't like I don't want to lose it. I think a lot of academics do, and
I'm gonna grab one because the portal wasn't cooperating. killed the camera, but they had to find the camera, and they found it. Yeah, we had people sitting right in front of the camera, so.
Maybe better anyway. I don't know. Okay, I'll do that. I'm gonna get the phone.